Hi, my name is Jacob, and I'm a park ranger at the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park in Plains, Georgia. I'm here to tell you a little bit about President Jimmy Carter. He was an entrepreneur from a very young age, and that experience shaped President Carter and his policies that he advocated for in the White House. Our park is about 150 miles south of Atlanta, in Plains, Georgia, where President Carter went to school and where he still lives today. Actually, President Carter lives in our park, and that makes him the only living president who currently lives in a national park, aside from the current president who lives in the White House, which is also a national park. When people often talk about President Carter's hometown, they mainly associate him with Plains, Georgia. And although he definitely had childhood connections to Plains, he actually lived and played in the smaller satellite community of Archery, Georgia. The Carter family was only one of two white families in the entire community of Archery, so President Carter was fully immersed in an African American community from the age of 4 when his family moved to Archery. President Carter also grew up around successful entrepreneurs, like his father, Earl Carter, who employed about 24 families to work on the 2,360 acres of farmland that he oversaw. He also operated a general store, he ran a dairy and cane syrup business, and he was a landlord to most of his farm workers. On top of all that, he also sat on the regional telephone and electric board. Now let's hear about Jimmy Carter's experience as a businessman from President Carter himself.
Well, I had a job from the time I was old enough to work in the field. My first job on the farm was carrying water to the other workers in the field who were chopping cotton or picking peanuts, or doing things like that. And I would go to the nearby spring. It bubbled up out of the ground then, a lot of them. And I would get a bucket of water and carry it to the field, and the workers there would drink water, and I'd go back and get some more. It was a very difficult job. When I got to be about 5 or 6 years old, my daddy let me have peanuts out of his field, beginning in, I'd say, early July, when school was out. And I would go into the field every afternoon, pull up peanuts out of the ground where they grow, and take them back to our house in a little red wagon that I pulled, and pick the peanuts off the vine and wash them good and put them in salt water. And the next morning I'd get up about 4 o'clock in the morning and boil my peanuts and with salt, and then put them in little paper bags, half a pound each, about 20 of them on an average, and I would walk down the railroad track about 2 miles to Plains, and I would sell 20 bags of peanuts, usually before dinner time, lunchtime. And that gave me an income of $1 a day, because the peanuts were 5 cents a bag, 20 of them. And I was making as much income as the average full-grown adult that worked in the fields for $1 a day, from before daybreak until after sundown. So I had a fairly good income as a little child. And it was hard work. And when I got back home, I would eat dinner with my family, lunch, and then I would go out in the field in the afternoon and start the process all over again. On Saturdays, I would do about twice as many, about 40 bags of peanuts, and because I worked all day downtown selling my product. And so I had a good job. Later, when I got to be, I'd say, high school age, I formed a partnership with my first cousin, Hugh Carter, in the old bank building, which is now a restaurant in Plains. And we would sell ice cream and hamburgers. 3 dips of ice cream for a nickel, 5 cents, and a big hamburger for 5 cents. And I would also then put my peanuts on the counter, and I'd sell peanuts along with the hamburgers and ice cream. So I was a business person, you might say, beginning when I was 5 or 6 years old, all the way up until I went off to college. I'm standing in my daddy's store, which we call a commissary. Daddy had the same stock of goods in Plains back in 1928, but he moved it out here. And we had in the store just the basic things that people needed. In those days, in the Great Depression, there was not any money much. And people traded in eggs and pigs and chickens and things like that. Most of the food then was very cheap. A big loaf of bread was 5 cents. Eggs were about 1 cent each. We sold cheese and butter and meat that my daddy cured. We sold overalls that cost about $1.50 then. A pair of shoes, cheap shoes, cost $1. The best shoes cost $3. They were Wolverines, I remember that. And this was where people came to buy their basic necessities that they had to have: meal, flour, sugar, salt, and things like that. This was a time too when people had to work hard to make a living. A grown man was paid $1 a day for going to work before sunrise, before daybreak, as a matter of fact, working till sundown. And an able-bodied woman working by the day would get 75 cents for the same time. A strong, young, teenage boy that couldn't take care of mules well and horses got 75 cents a day. But that went a long way with the cheap prices that we had then. This store was open full-time just on Saturday afternoons, but whenever anybody wanted to buy anything in between time, even if it was a 5-cent bottle of castor oil, we'd have to come out here with the keys, unlock the store, sell them the castor oil, make out a ticket because it wouldn't pay until Saturday afternoon, and then lock the store back and go back to the house. It was a constant nuisance for children because Daddy always threw me the keys whenever anybody came during mealtime to make a purchase. This was kind of the center of life on Saturdays because this is where my father paid the workers who had been putting in hard labor on the farm, and it was where they paid their accounts and where we settled up with each other. The store was a good place, and it kind of exemplifies or demonstrates a life during the Great Depression years, a life of no money, but a good life for companionship and mutual care and love. My daddy had a farm supply business before I came home from the Navy in 1953, and I took over that small business of buying peanuts and so forth and expanded it over time. My mother was a partner with me, and my youngest brother Billy was a partner when he came back home from the U.S. Marines. And so we sold fertilizer and seed for planting and feed for livestock and insecticides to control the insects in the fields. And then in the harvest time, we bought peanuts from the farmers and corn, whatever they had for a surplus. A little bit later on, after a few years, I built a cotton gin. So we ginned farmers' cotton, and I had storage warehouses to put the cotton in. So we bought and sold peanuts and cotton on a very large scale, and dealt with about I'd say 200 farmers in supplying their needs for what they planted in the spring, the fertilizer and so forth, and how they grew their crops. So I would quite often sell all of that material for the farmers to plant on credit, and then they would pay me by bringing me their crops when they harvested in the fall, bringing in the cotton and peanuts.
Now, what the videos didn't tell you was that when he was around middle school age, he bought up some excess bales of cotton when the price crashed. He held on to that cotton until the price came back up, and then he sold them to make a profit. Then he used the money that he earned from the cotton to purchase some tenant houses that he rented out to farm workers through his time in college. So as you can see, President Carter was working hard as a farmer, a salesman, a concession stand operator, a store clerk, an investor, and a landlord, all before he graduated from high school, and all during the Great Depression. Certainly Jimmy Carter is most well known for being a peanut farmer and a farm supply salesman after he came home from the Navy when his father passed away in 1953. He made that decision because he realized what an impact his father had on the local community, and he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. It was a difficult time for his family. Jimmy Carter only made $300 their first year back, and the Carters had to live in public housing. Although their profits increased in the years to come, Jimmy Carter faced a difficult reality as a white businessman in the Civil Rights era South. As the federal government began enforcing civil rights legislation and principles across the country, many in the white community of Plains began joining organizations dedicated to racial inequality and preserving the system of segregation. President Carter had a choice to make. Should he do the right thing by resisting the white supremacist who would then retaliate by boycotting his business and shunning him in the community? Or should he compromise and join the white supremacist group to preserve his business and his social position? Before I tell you which option Jimmy Carter chose, think about what you would do in a similar position. I think it's easy for most people to say, well, of course I do the right thing and stand for equality. But how easy would that be if it meant losing your job? How easy would it be if it meant losing the friends you've had since birth? How easy would it be if it meant disappointing important people in your life, like your former teachers? You would be alone, you would have no money, and no one will want to come help you. Doing the right thing is often not the easy thing. But that is exactly what Jimmy Carter did. He risked his business to stand up for those who had less power. He even flushed a $20 bill down the toilet when a community member asked if he wasn't joining because he didn't have the money to pay the membership fee. And Jimmy Carter carried that moral integrity and hard work and frugality into the governorship and the presidency. His influences as a child led President Carter to hate waste and to hate hate. During his inaugural address for the governorship of Georgia in 1971, he bluntly said the time for racial discrimination is over. And even though it alienated former political supporters, he also set out to radically change the state government by consolidating the 285 state agencies down to 20 agencies to make the state more efficient. He introduced zero-based budgeting, where the budget had to be re-examined from scratch every year, and he led international trade missions for the state to attract the best investors to Georgia from around the globe. He continued many of these policies at the national level as president in 1977. Early in his presidency, he called for energy efficiency to reduce waste, everything from increasing the role of renewable energies, like the solar panels he installed on the roof of the White House, to pushing car manufacturers to make engines more efficient to conserve gasoline. He even asked average people to turn down their thermostats during the winter and wear a sweater at home instead of burning more heating oil. Many of these policies and his push for efficiency through government reform led President Carter to establish the Department of Energy. And he also created inspectors general's offices throughout the federal government to further identify waste and fraud in government spending. The lessons President Carter learned as a child entrepreneur instilled the values that he carried into the White House. President Carter, from an early age, embraced the reality that all people are equal, regardless of the color of their skin. Even if the threat of financial ruin and social rejection loomed over him, he had the integrity to stand up for that principle as a businessman and as an elected official. He also used his time in office to use his problem-solving skills to address one of the nation's biggest challenges during his term, and that was the energy crisis. He advocated for both personal responsibility from citizens and a diversification of energy resources from the energy industry. All of this took hard work, determination, and moral fortitude to see it through. And that is the rich entrepreneurial legacy of President Jimmy Carter.